Let's dive right into today's explainer, because we are unpacking a truly fascinating piece of source material. We're actually going to step directly into a myth. We'll be framing our journey today as a sort of graphic novel-style fable where we follow two figures known simply as the Sage and the Spirit on an actual physical descent into the dark. We're exploring the Library of the Abyss, specifically a section called Bibliotheca Melancholia. This is essentially a profound architectural map of human melancholy, and it traces this incredible long arc from ancient biblical philosophy all the way down to the freezing depths of existentialism and nihilism. So let's step across the threshold, right alongside the Sage. Our fable begins with the Spirit extending this long, unhurried invitation to the Sage. Instead of just talking across a doorway into some dark, empty void, the Spirit invites him to actually walk through it. And as they take a dozen or so paces into the dark, the void resolves into something completely unexpected. The Spirit reveals that, hey, this isn't an endless empty black hole. It's a corridor of shelves, a library. The text describes the air here smelling of dust, tallow, and ancient paper that's been read by candlelight for lifetimes. The Sage, he expects total nothingness, but instead, he finds that the abyss has actually been furnished. As the Spirit brilliantly puts it, this is simply where the abyss keeps its books. Now, let's move a bit deeper and see how this library is cataloged, because it's pretty wild. The shelves aren't sorted alphabetically by author, right? And they aren't sorted by publication date either. Instead, they are categorized by what the Spirit calls temperature. The library maps the actual climate of human grief. The warmest texts sit on the outer aisles, and as you physically move toward the center of the room, the temperature drops until you hit absolute cold. As the Spirit explains it, a person doesn't reach for a book because the author's name starts with a certain letter. They reach for the specific shelf that perfectly matches the exact coldness of their own evening.
Okay, let's step into Alcove 1, the oldest honest shelf. Subtitle, Where Grief Becomes a Legitimate Discipline. Let's see what's actually here.
Right, so here, the Sage and the Spirit find the warmest texts in the entire room. We're talking ancient texts. The covers are cracked leather and the languages are incredibly old. This shelf holds biblical wisdom literature. We have Kohelet's scroll from Ecclesiastes, the long and agonizing complaint of Job, and the 5 brief laments of a prophet watching Jerusalem literally burn to the ground. The Spirit points out something crucial here. This is the first library anywhere that was willing to treat grief not as a temporary malfunction that needs some quick cure, but as a legitimate discipline, something to be studied and honestly endured.
And this beautifully illustrates the philosophical core of this first alcove. The Sage traces his finger over the word hevel in Ecclesiastes. If we look at the philology, hevel roughly translates to vapor or breath. The Sage realizes that studying this ancient vapor doesn't make it evaporate. Actually, the grief just grows more precisely shaped the more you examine it. Now, when these ancient authors wrote, they firmly believed a judge was listening to their laments. But the really profound takeaway on this shelf is that the grief endures, completely regardless of whether the judge is there or not. The true power of this alcove is what survives even after the ancient beliefs themselves have departed.
Moving on, we step out of the warmth of antiquity and hit Alcove 2, the shelf that argues with itself. Subtitle, Existentialism in the Colder Light. So what happens as it gets colder?
Well, this brings us squarely into the 19th and 20th centuries, the realm of existentialism. The books here are bound in this dark, restless cloth. You've got Sartre leaning against Camus like two tired men sharing the exact same bench. And the Sage makes a brilliant, just spot-on observation here. He says, existentialism is simply wisdom literature that stopped waiting for the judge to arrive. Think about that. It's the exact same grief from the first alcove, the exact same hevel or vapor, but now the authors are trapped inside a courtroom they are absolutely certain will remain empty. They just have to figure out what a man is supposed to do with the furniture.
The really fascinating thing is how this shelf is entirely divided against itself. It's like a cosmic tug-of-war. On one hand, you have Soren Kierkegaard. The Sage opens Fear and Trembling and sees the Knight of Faith suspended indefinitely between resignation and a leap. Kierkegaard is desperately trying to build a self worth having. But then, immediately beside him, you have Friedrich Nietzsche. And the text notes that the spine of Nietzsche's book is cracked right at the passage of the eternal return. Cracked because generations of readers literally had to stop breathing at the crushing weight of that specific sentence. Nietzsche is trying to prove that no self was ever stable enough to build in the first place. So this entire alcove is just locked in this frozen, brilliant argument between constructing meaning and completely dismantling it.
Let's see what happens as the temperature absolutely plummets. They reach Alcove 3, the shelf without bread, the absolute cold of nihilism.
So this alcove actually holds the fewest volumes, almost as if the library itself has to ration how much of this incredibly heavy, freezing material the floorboards can safely support. We are in the absolute cold of nihilism now. We see the thick, systematic weight of Schopenhauer, the merciless essays of Zaffe, and the deliberately broken fragments of Cioran. And the Spirit issues a really stark warning about this space. It offers absolutely zero sustenance, none. There is no modest table left standing at the end of the argument. There is no bread. Visitors, including our sage, generally don't read these books to move in permanently. They only come to this freezing alcove to confirm that a floor actually exists at the very bottom of the abyss, and then they leave.
Moving past the freezing depths of nihilism, they unexpectedly enter a section the sage didn't anticipate at all. Alcove 4, the unwritten shelf, the endless catalog of melancholy.
Here, they find row upon row of volumes with covers, but the pages are entirely blank. They're just waiting. The Spirit explains that the library is never actually finished. Every single century adds its own melancholy to the collection, inventing new languages for that exact same ancient vapor. And what is incredibly striking here, and a bit haunting for us, is that the Spirit says our century, right now, is currently writing here. But obviously we aren't writing on scrolls or in cracked leather tomes. We are writing in inboxes and on glowing screens. We are busy cataloging the identical, timeless exhaustion. We're just giving it new, highly clinical names. The ink is literally being pressed into these blank spines right now from a quieter room just beyond the shelf.
Taking in all of this massive, cold, patient architecture, the sage turns to the Spirit and asks the million-dollar question: why keep it? If Ecclesiastes, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and the modern inbox all ultimately agree that the ledger of human suffering just doesn't balance, what is the point of this massive archive? Why go to the trouble of preserving all this pain just to confirm the exact same guilty verdict over and over and over again?
The Spirit's response here shifts the entire meaning of their journey. He just drops these two profound words, not confirmation, company. The Spirit explains that a person who reads Koheleth right next to Schopenhauer learns a profound secret. They learn that their specific, terrible evening has actually been visited before. It has been survived before by other honest people in other honest centuries. You are not required to be the first person to survive the dark.
So what is the true purpose of this library? Well, it is absolutely not an escape from the abyss. The abyss is still very much there, but the library is proof that the abyss has been furnished, however sparsely. It exists to honor every single person who stood at that terrifying doorway, decided to write something down, and then turned back to keep living. The sage looks down the unmeasured length of the shelves and finally realizes what he is standing in. It isn't just an archive of sadness. It is a long, highly patient vigil, kept entirely in ink instead of flame.
The fable wraps up as the sage and the Spirit walk back out. They retrace their steps past the blank spines of the modern age, past the freezing cold of nihilism, past the restless arguing of the existentialists, and back through the warm, cracked leather of ancient wisdom. The sage finally returns to his own stone chamber, his own candle and his own vigil. But something in his room now feels very slightly less empty than it had at sunset. He realizes that his grief keeps much better company than he ever let himself believe. The library was actually a mercy, showing him that through honest subtraction he wasn't alone.
I want to leave you with a direct question to ponder, the exact same one this fable leaves hanging in the air. The library shelves are going to keep exactly the same whether you visit them or not. That is their most reliable virtue. But when you inevitably stand at the doorway of your own abyss, when you face the unwritten shelves of your own century, what will you write down before turning back? Thank you so much for joining me on this descent into the library today in this explainer. Keep seeking out the wisdom on the shelves, and I'll see you next time.